This is a tutorial for my daisy crown hat pattern, and this tutorial accompanies the written pattern that I will link down in the description. Before we start making a hat, we need to work out what size hat we need to make. So you need to measure your head circumference, and then using the measurements that I've put up on your screen, select either a small, a medium or a large. For example, if I measured my head and it was 54 centimeters, I would choose a size medium. The hat we're going to make is actually going to be a little bit smaller than these measurements on the screen because our hat needs to stretch to fit our head. Although this is a tutorial for a beanie fit hat, you can make your hat a little bit slouchier like I have done with the pink hat on the screen. I'll explain how we do this when we get there. So let's talk about what you're going to need to make this hat. So in terms of yarn, you're going to want any double knit yarn that's a category 3 weight yarn that has some sort of stretch in it. I'm going to be using Drops Merino Extra Fine. That's a superwash treated extra fine merino wool yarn, and it's got a lovely stretch and bounce to it. And it is a yarn that recommends a 4mm hook, which is what we're going to be using. And then in terms of yardage, if you want to use a different yarn, this is 50 grams, there's 105 meters of yarn. So I'm using 3 colors for my hat. I'm using a yellow, a white and a green. I'll put the exact colors, if you want to use these exact colors, down in the description. You're going to want 1 ball of yellow, 1 ball of white, and then for the main color of the hat, if you're doing a small like I have, you're only going to want 2 balls of this yarn. If you're doing a medium or a large, you're going to want 3 balls of yarn, but your mileage may vary. You may use less, you may use more, depending on your tension. So in terms of hooks, we're going to be using a 4mm crochet hook and a 3.5mm crochet hook. So I'm going to be showing you how to measure your gauge for this hat, which is important for the fit of the hat, later on in this tutorial. So you may end up using bigger or smaller hooks than this, so make sure you've got a range of commonly used crochet hook sizes. You're also going to need a tapestry needle, and this is not just for weaving our ends in, we actually use it to sew some seams in this hat as well. And then any pair of scissors, they don't have to be a fancy pair of yarn snips like mine. Right, let's get started making this hat. To make your hat, you're going to need to start making some of these flower granny squares. I'm going to take you through it all step by step. For size small, you're going to need to make 6. For a medium, you need to make 7. And for a large, you need to make 8. So let's get started by learning how to make one of these squares. For the granny squares, I'm using the 4mm crochet hook, and we're going to start with the yellow yarn to form the centre of our daisy. And to form the centre of the daisy, we're going to make a magic ring. You can use whatever sort of magic ring you like, but I prefer a double magic ring. So I'm going to take my yarn tail and wrap it around my first finger 3 times like so, and then I'm holding my middle finger up against my first finger just to pin those yarn wraps in place. Then I'm going to take my crochet hook and put it underneath those first 2 wraps and grab the 3rd wrap with my crochet hook and pull it under those other 2 wraps. I can then remove the magic ring from my finger. So the magic ring is these 2 strands here, and we're going to be crocheting around them for our first round. So to start our first round, we're going to make a chain of 1. And then we're going to make 8 single crochet around both of the loops of the magic ring. That single crochet in US terms, they're called double crochets in UK terms. So let's make our 8 single crochet. So I'm going to put my hook under both of the loops of the magic ring, grab that yarn to form my single crochet. And we're going to repeat this all the way around until we've got 8 single crochet. I'm just going to speed this up. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we've got 8 single crochet now around our magic ring. So to close the double magic ring, it's a little bit different to a normal magic ring. You can't just pull on this yarn tail. What you need to do is gently tug on this yarn tail whilst watching both of the strands that form the magic ring. One of them is going to tighten and we need to grab it. So I'm going to pull on this yarn tail, and that is the strand that's starting to tighten. So I'm going to grab it, and then I pull on that strand, and that tightens the one that didn't tighten, just like that. And then I'm going to pull on my yarn tail to get rid of that baggy loop there. And that's our magic ring closed up. You might still have a little hole in the centre, but it doesn't really matter too much. So to finish off round 1, I'm going to slip stitch in the top of that very first single crochet that we've made. Make a slip stitch, and then I prefer to make an additional chain 1 just to be extra secure before snipping my yarn tail. And then using my crochet hook to pull that yarn tail through that chain 1, and I'll give that a good tug to make sure that's secure. So that's round 1 finished. So for round 2, I'm going to be using an off-white yarn to form my daisy petals. And to join this white yarn to the centre of our granny square, I'm going to put my crochet hook underneath both of the loops at the top of any stitch. It doesn't matter which stitch you choose here. Then I'm going to lay my yarn across my crochet hook, leaving a decent end to weave in later. I'm going to grab that yarn and pull it through that stitch, and now we've joined our white yarn to the yellow of our centre. I'm going to take the yarn tail and I'm going to lay it alongside the next few stitches because I like to crochet over the top of it as I go, and it makes life a little bit easier when I come back to weave my ends in. So to start round 2, we're going to start with a chain of 3, and this counts as our first double crochet. That's double crochet in US terms, trebles in UK terms. So I'm going to make 3 more double crochet into the same stitch. I'm not going into the next stitch, we're going into the same stitch, and we're going to make 3 more double crochets. So that's 1, 2, 3. Oops. So I've got my 3 double crochets and my starting chain. Now to turn these 4 stitches into a popcorn stitch, I'm going to take my crochet hook out of this loop, and I haven't got much tension on this yarn over here at all, so that loop should just stay in place when I take this hook out of it. Now I'm going to take my crochet hook and I'm going to put it into, let me just bring it a little bit closer to the camera for you. I'm going to put it into the top of my starting chain here. So I'm going to put my hook in there, into the top of that starting chain. And I'm going to grab that loop we just dropped, pick it up again, and I'm going to pull that loop through the top of that starting chain with my crochet hook. And this causes the stitches to pop out a little bit and form our popcorn stitch. So before we make our next popcorn stitch, we're going to chain 2, and you need to chain 2 loosely. If you have a tight tension or you're a tight chainer, you might want to consider chaining 3 here, as we're going to need this granny square to stretch a bit so it fits our head. So I'm going to make 2 loose chains here. And then we're going to make a popcorn stitch into the next stitch. So I'm going to make 4 double crochets into the next stitch. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. So I've made 4 double crochets all into the same stitch. And then we're going to repeat the steps of that last popcorn. So I'm going to loosen the tension on my yarn, take my crochet hook out of that loop, put it through both of the loops at the top of the first stitch of that group of 4. So I'm going into that stitch there. And I'm going to grab that loop that we dropped and pull it through the top of that first stitch, like so. And then I'm going to do 2 more loose chains. So we're going to repeat this all the way around. So I'll stay with you for 1 more popcorn stitch. So I'm going to make 4 double crochets all into the top of the next stitch. So that's my 2nd double crochet, my 3rd double crochet, and my 4th double crochet. Then I'm going to take the tension off of my yarn, take my hook out of that loop, put my hook underneath both of the loops at the top of that first stitch of that group of 4, grab that loop and pull it through, forming the popcorn stitch. So you're going to repeat this all the way around, making a popcorn into each of the top of the 8 single crochets with a chain 2 separating between them. And I will meet you back at the end of this round to fasten off together. Okay, so I've finished all 8 of my popcorns and I've got chain 2 just to join these last 2 popcorns together. So with popcorn stitches, the first and the last stitch sort of go behind the popcorn, so it can be a little bit tricky to find out where we need to put our hook to slip stitch to join. So if we have a look at our first popcorn stitch, what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to flip it over the top, because then we can see our starting chain running along here, and it's quite easy to see where we need to slip stitch if we look at it from the top, because can you see the next chain 2? We're actually going to go into that space there where that chain comes out of, and I'm going to make my slip stitch there to fasten off. I'm going to fasten off just as I did in round 1. So it's really important here to check that your daisy has stretch to it. If it's really stiff and there's no stretch, you're going to struggle to get the hat onto your head. So you need to make sure that this daisy just has, it doesn't need a lot, just a little bit of give in it. So let's make round 3 now. So for round 3, I'm going to be joining in this green yarn, and we're going to be working round 3 in those chain 2 spaces between the popcorns, not into the stitches at the top of the popcorns. We're going to ignore them. We're just going to be crocheting into the spaces. So I'm going to put my crochet hook into that chain 2 space there, and then we'll join our yarn just like we joined our yarn at the end of round 1. We're going to lay it across our crochet hook and pull up a loop, grab it and pull up a loop through that chain 2 space. Then I like to lay my yarn alongside the chain space. And now we're ready to start round 3. So we're going to start our round 3, and we're actually going to form part of the corner of the square. So we're going to make a chain of 3, and this counts as our first double crochet stitch. And then we're going to make 2 more double crochets into that same chain 2 space. So that's 1 double crochet and 2 double crochet. And then we're going to skip over into the next chain 2 space. And in this chain 2 space, I'm going to make 3 half double crochets, or half trebles if you use UK terms, so half double crochets. To do this, I'm yarning over, putting my hook into the space, grabbing a loop and pulling it up, and then I'm yarning over and pulling through all 3 loops on our hook, and that forms our half double crochet stitch. We're going to work a total of 3 of them into this chain space. So that's 3 half double crochets made into that chain space. Now into the next chain space, we're going to make a corner. So first work 3 double crochet into that chain space. So that's 1 double crochet, 2 double crochet, and 3 double crochet, 1, 2, 3. And then to form our corner space, chain 2, 1, 2. And then we're going to make 3 more double crochet into the same space. We're not going into the next space, we're going into that same space we just crocheted in. And we're going to make 3 more double crochet. So that's our second double crochet and our third double crochet, all into the same space to make the corner of our square. Then in the next space, work 3 half double crochets. So that's 1, 2, 3. And then in the next space, we're going to make another corner group of 3 double crochets, chain 2, 3 double crochets. And you're going to do this all the way around, alternating between one of these corner groups and 3 half double crochets until you've got 4 corners. And then I'm going to meet you down here, because this corner down here we need to complete at the end of the round. So I'll meet you back here. So I've worked my way around my square until I get right up to this last corner. I've just done 3 half double crochets, and to finish off this corner we're going to be working 3 double crochets back into that same space where we joined our yarn. So that's 1 double crochet, 2 double crochet, and then 3 double crochet. Then I'm going to make a chain of 2 for my last corner. And then we're going to finish off with an invisible join. So I'm going to cut my yarn, leaving about a 20 to 25 centimeters. That's about a 10-inch tail. That's because we're going to be using this tail to sew our squares together. So don't be skimpy here. So I'm going to snip my yarn tail. And then to do an invisible join, I'm going to use my crochet hook to pull that long end through that chain 2. Then I'm going to thread my yarn tail onto a large blunt tapestry needle. So to make our invisible join, we need to take our tapestry needle and we're going to be putting it under both loops at the top of the stitch that is next to our starting chain. So here is our starting chain and here is the next stitch, and we're going to put our tapestry needle underneath both of those loops there and pull the yarn through. Don't pull your yarn through too tightly. What we want here is we want that yarn loop there to be about the same length as the one next to it there. And then the next part of the invisible join is we're going to create another loop by putting our tapestry needle through the back loop only of that second chain and pulling that through with just the right amount of tension to make it match up. So we've just created that loop there and that loop there, which gives us a seamless finish to the edge of our granny square. Then to finish off this invisible join, I'm going to put my yarn needle up through those back 2 loops there, and that's just above the starting chain. And we're going to be using this tail to sew our granny squares together, and then we're going to weave our end in effectively. So don't worry about this coming open or loose, because the tension of our stitches sewing the granny squares together will keep it closed. So before we go any further, we need to check the gauge of our square. And I know that some of you out there will be rolling your eyes because you never check gauge. However, for a hat or any garment, it is really important we get the right gauge, because that is what allows us to get the right fit. So we're going to measure across our square from side to side, not corner to corner, and it should measure 6.5 centimeters. That's 2.5 inches if you prefer imperial units, so 6.5 centimeters. So what do you do if your square is not 6.5 centimeters? You need to start again and use a different size hook. So if your square is bigger than 6.5 centimeters, you need to go down a hook size. So we used a 4mm hook for this square. You might need a 3.75 or even a 3.5mm hook to get gauge. Now, if your square is too small, if it's less than about 6 centimeters, then you need to start again and go up a hook size to a 4.5mm and keep changing your hook size until your square measures 6.5 centimeters. Now, if your square is just under 6.5 centimeters, maybe somewhere between 6 and 6.5 centimeters, you will be okay as long as your square can stretch. So as you can see, the yarn that I've used for this square is quite stretchy. So if my square was only 6 centimeters, my hat would still fit me because as I wear it, it would stretch. So again, make sure you check your gauge. So I've got 6 daisy granny squares here because I'm going to be making a small hat. If you're making a medium, you will have 7. If you're making a large, you will have 8. And what I'm going to do is we're going to be sewing all of these granny squares into one long strip and then joining the 2 ends of that strip into a ring. And this ring is going to form the basis of our hat. So to sew our granny squares together, what we're first going to do is we're going to line up all of our squares with the correct orientation. So let me just get rid of some of these squares so you can see what I mean. So what we want is we want that yarn tail, that corner up here, to be in the top left when we're laying out all of our squares. I'm just going to lay out 3 here just for demonstration, but you need to lay out all 6, 7 or 8 of your squares, and they all need to have that yarn tail in the top left corner. This is important because we're going to be using that yarn tail to stitch down. So to stitch our squares together, I'm going to first thread my yarn needle onto this corner, onto this needle, and then we're going to take the first 2 squares and making sure we're keeping this orientation, we're going to lay them wrong sides together like this. So you should have the tail from the front square in the top right and the back square in the bottom right. And now we're going to stitch these squares together using a stitch called whip stitch. So I'm going to take my yarn needle and I'm going to put my yarn needle under both of the loops of the back square of the second chain of that corner. So you can see our 2 chains here. I'm putting my yarn needle under the second chain and pulling that through. And then I'm going to go to the front square and do the same. So I'm going to put my yarn needle underneath the first loop of that chain. This one's a little tight on the square. And then under the back loop of that second chain. So I'm going through the second chain of that corner. And then I'm going to move across before I pull this needle through. And I'm going to put my needle underneath both of the loops of the next stitch along from that corner. And then we're going to keep repeating that all the way along. So I'm going to move over to the underneath both of the loops of the next stitch here of the front square, if I can find it. Ooh. There we go. And then we're going under the next to both loops of the next stitch, and we're going to keep doing this all the way along until our squares are joined on one side. So I'm going to keep stitching all the way along, and I will meet you once we reach this corner here. So I've stitched all the way along here, and I've just got a couple of stitches left at this side. So I'm going to repeat those steps. I'm going through those 2 loops of the next stitch. Then my next stitch here is the first chain of this corner. So I'm going to go under both of those loops. So now I've gone through that first chain. I know I don't need to stitch any more of this back square because we've sort of stitched all the way down that side. So I'm going to stop there, and then I'm going to go through the front 2 loops of just the first chain of that front square. Ooh, and that's our join finished. You may wish to tie a little knot with your yarn tail here just to keep that join where it is, and then weave this end into one of these squares at the back. And we're going to repeat this all the way along with all of the squares. So my next join will be this one here along here, and keep repeating this until you've formed a ring of all 6, 7 or 8 of your granny squares, and then come back to this tutorial and I will show you how we're going to add ribbing to the bottom of our hat. So here is my finished ring of daisy granny squares. I've sewn them all together and woven in the ends. Now this is a really good time to try this on, as this will be the circumference that your hat will need to be. So it should be snug. It definitely shouldn't be loose. It should be snug but not too tight. If it needs to stretch a little bit to fit your head, that's completely fine, because as you wear this hat will stretch ever so slightly. So no worries if it's a little bit too snug. So we're now going to add the ribbing to one side, and then at the top we're going to crochet around for the crown that will form the top of the hat. So let's start with the ribbing. Before we crochet the actual ribbing to form the brim of our hat, we're going to crochet a setup round, and I'm going to be using green for this, the main colour for my hat, and we're going to be working a round of single crochet around one side of this ring. So I'm going to join my yarn to literally any stitch, we'll just go for that one, on one of these granny squares around. And I'm going to lay my yarn across the top of my hook and pull that loop through that stitch, just like we did previously to join a new colour of yarn. So to crochet our setup round, we're going to chain 1, and then that doesn't count as a stitch. We're going to make a single crochet into the same stitch. And what we're going to do for this round is we're going to work a single crochet into every stitch and into every chain corner space as we go around. So you should have 11 single crochets per square. So I'm going to work some single crochet and then we will count some stitches. So I'm going to work a single crochet into the top of every stitch, And then when we get to the corner spaces, I'm going to work 1 single crochet in this corner space and 1 single crochet in this corner space. So that's 1 and then 1 in the next space. Then I'm going to keep going, working 1 single crochet into each stitch and space around. So that should be 11 single crochet into each square. So your stitch count at the end of your setup round should be 66 for size small, 77 for size medium, and 88 for size large. So I'm going to meet you back at the end of this setup round, and then we're going to transition into crocheting on the ribbing. So I've finished my setup round and I've double checked and my stitch count is definitely 66. So I'm going to make a slip stitch into the top of that first single crochet and fasten off just like we did with our granny squares. So now we're ready to add the ribbing to this setup round, and I'll just show you one that I've already finished. So this is what the ribbing looks like, and I've done it in a contrast colour for this hat. And what we actually do is we work rows of single crochet through the back loop across like this and do a slip stitch join along here to join that ribbing on. So don't worry if that sounds complicated, I'm going to take you through it all. So for the ribbing, we're going to need to go down a hook size. So I was using a 4mm hook, so I'm going to be using a 3.5mm hook for the ribbing. And that's because we want this ribbing to be a little bit tighter than the rest of the hat to make sure that it stays on our head, and it will stretch to fit your head as well. So using my 3.5mm hook and some fresh yarn, I'm actually going to start with a slip knot. So to make a slip knot, I like to pull the working yarn with my hook and then twist it round, and I use that twist instead of a slip knot, but you can make a normal slip knot if you prefer. I'm then going to chain 7. So your chain needs to be longer if you're making a medium or a large size hat. So if you're making a medium, this chain needs to be 8, and if you're making a large, it needs to be 9. So I should have made 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I've made a chain of 7. And then I like to do this ribbing with my hat to one side so that I can crochet my ribbing rows like this. So now I've made my chain of 7. I'm going to make a slip stitch into literally any of those single crochets from the setup round that we just made. So I'm going to put my hook into one of those stitches and I'm going to make a slip stitch like this. So you can see I've got my slip stitch here and then my chain, and then I'm going to turn the whole thing over. So I'm looking, if I move that hook out of the way, I'm looking at the back of this chain. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to chain 1, and then I'm going to work a single crochet into each chain across. So I'm going to skip that chain we just made, that doesn't count as a stitch. We're going to make a single crochet into each chain across. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 'Hook does not want to go into these chains. That's 7. So I've made 7 single crochets, 1 into each of those chains. Then I'm going to chain 1. This doesn't count as a stitch. And then I'm going to flip the whole thing over again. So we're going to be, like I showed you in that one that was finished, we're going to be working like this to make our ribbing, back and forth in rows. So now the ribbing is formed because we're going to be making our single crochet stitches through the back loop, and that's not the back loop of the stitch that's the front, it's the back loop of what's facing us. So if I move this over so we're looking at it from the top, you can see those V's at the top of the stitch. So we're going to be working all of our single crochets from this point onwards through the back loop. So I'm going to put my hook into that loop there, that is the back loop there, and I'm going to make a single crochet, and then I'm going to move on and do a back loop single crochet into each of those 7 single crochets from the previous row. So I'm just going to work those single crochets across here until I've got 7, and you might find once you reach the other side that that last one is a little bit harder to find. It's that one there. And then I'm just going to, I recommend you count every row for these because it's quite easy to just miss a stitch. That's 3, 6, 7, so 7 single crochets there. And then, oh, I've got this twisted. So then, and now we should be looking at the front of our work. We've got that one slip stitch attaching our single crochet rows to it. And then where that previous slip stitch is, we're going to skip that next stitch and we're going to work a slip stitch into the stitch after that. Just like that. And then I'm going to chain 1. Then I'm going to flip the whole thing over again. And we're going to repeat what we did. So we're going to work a single crochet through the back loop along all 7 of those stitches. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Don't forget that if you're making a medium or large, your stitch count here will be different. If you're making a medium, you'll have 8 single crochets, and if you're doing a large, it will be 9. So I've made my 7 single crochets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I'm going to chain 1. That doesn't count as a stitch, and I'm going to flip it all over again. It gets easier now to work out right from wrong. Now we've got 2 slip stitches, so we're looking at the right side of our daisy squares now, and we're going to work a single crochet through the back loop of each of those single crochet. So that's, oh, try that again. So that's 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I've done my 7 single crochet, and then I'm going to do exactly the same as before. So here is my previous slip stitch, and I'm going to skip the next stitch and slip stitch in the stitch after that. Then I'm going to chain 1, turn the whole thing over and continue. And you need to do these rows all the way around your hat, and I will meet you back at the end once you've done all of those rows of ribbing, and I'll show you how we finish off and join this seam here. So I've worked my way around my hat doing those rows of back loop single crochet for the ribbing, and my last row is a row with the right side of the hat facing, and I've ended up right next to those granny squares. I'm not finished up here, I finished down here. And if you're working for a size small or a large, you will have 1 stitch between your first slip stitch join and your last slip stitch join. If you're a medium, you won't have a stitch here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to fasten off, and I'm going to cut my yarn tail, leaving it slightly longer than usual because we're going to use this yarn tail to sew those 2 ends of ribbing together. We're going to do it with whip stitch just like we did for those granny squares. So I'm just going to fasten off and then thread that yarn tail onto my needle, and we're going to whip stitch those 2 sides together just like we did before. So my first stitch, I'm actually going to go into that very first slip stitch there that we did at the end of our starting chain. So this is our starting chain along here. So I'm going to go through that slip stitch, and that should just make this hole here a little bit less visible. And then we're going to work whip stitch just like we did to join our granny squares through the tops of that single crochet row and through that loop of the chain that's left from our first row of ribbing. and we're just going to work our way along this seam just like we did for the granny squares. So stitch along here, secure your ends and weave them in, and then come back and we are going to do some rows and some decreases here to shape the top of the hat. So I've sewn my seam and woven in all of my ends, and this is what my hat is looking like. So the next step is to do another setup round. So before we started doing that ribbon, we did a round of single crochet on this side of the ring of granny squares. We're going to be doing the same on this side as well. So just as we did before, you're going to use the larger size hook, so the same size hook you used for your granny squares previously, not your smaller size hook we just used for the ribbing. And then we're going to join a new ball of yarn to any of these stitches. So I'm just going to put my hook in any stitch, and I'm going to join my yarn just like we've been doing previously by laying it across my crochet hook and then grabbing a loop and pulling it through. So just the same as our last setup round, I'm going to start with a chain of 1, that doesn't count as a stitch, and I'm going to work a single crochet into every stitch and those corner spaces around. And this means that you will have 11 single crochet per granny square. So you should have 11 single crochet per square. We've got 9 stitches plus those corner spaces. So your total stitch count should be 66 if you're making a small like me, 77 for a medium, and 88 for a large. So I'm going to do that round of single crochet, and then I'm going to meet you back at the end of this round because we're not going to be cutting our yarn at the end of this round. We're just going to transition straight up into the crown of the hat. So I've finished working my setup round of 66 single crochet, and then I'm going to join with a slip stitch. And before we move on to the rest of the crown of the hat, I'm just going to talk about what the next steps are with this hat that I've already finished. So the rest of the hat is worked in half double crochet, and we're going to be turning our hat over at the end of every round so that we're alternating working on the right and the wrong side, and that gives us this beautiful sort of stripy texture for our hat, and it just gives the hat a little bit more visual interest. The other thing to say about the rest of the crown of the hat is we're going to talk about how to make a hat that's a beanie fit and how to make a hat that's the slouchy fit, if you remember what I said at the very beginning of this tutorial. So the beanie fit hat fits your head a bit more snugly, and the slouchy fit hat has a bit more length on it, so it's a bit more of a slouchy fit. And to do this, we're going to be working the crown in 2 sections. So there's the section here, which is just straight rows of half double crochet. There's no increases, there's no decreases, it's literally just the same number of half double crochet stitches for as many rows as either the beanie hat needs, or as many rows as you like for how slouchy you want your hat to be. And then once we finish that section, which could be 1 row or it could be 10 rows, could be more than that even. So once we finish that section, we're actually then going to decrease every other round to get this lovely curved shape for the top of the hat so that it fits your head well. So I'm going to show you what that looks like now on the hat that I'm making. So I'm making a small hat, and I'm going to be following the instructions for a beanie fit. This hat was a slouchy fit and it's a large. So I'm making quite a different shaped hat. So now we're back here with the hat, and I'm going to start this round with a chain of 1, and then I'm going to turn my work over to work from the inside of the hat, from the wrong side of the crochet. And for this round, I'm just going to do 1 round of straight half double crochet. So that is my slip stitch there. So my first stitch is actually in that stitch there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work a round of 66 half double crochet, and I forgot to say earlier that chain 1 we just did does not count as a stitch. So yeah, do a whole round of 66 half double crochet. Don't forget your stitch count will be different if you're doing a medium or a large. So yeah, do your round of half double crochet, come back here and I'll explain the next steps. So I finished my round of half double crochet, and then I'm going to slip stitch into the top of that first stitch to join. Then I'm going to chain 1, again this doesn't count as a stitch, and then I'm going to turn over because the next round I'm going to work from the front side. So for a beanie fit hat, For a small size, I don't need to work any more rows of half double crochet. I'm going to go straight into the decreases. However, if you're making a medium fit beanie, you need to do 2 more rows of half double crochet after this. And if you're making a large fit beanie, you need to work another 4 rows of half double crochet. And then if you want a slouchy fit, you need to work even more rows than that until it's the right amount of slouch for you. So we're going to dive straight into the decreases now, but pause this video and come back if you're making a different size. So from now on, we're going to be working 11 decreases every alternate row. So every time we're looking at the front of our hat, we're going to work 11 decreases across that whole round. So this means that your stitch counts are going to be a little bit different if you're doing a medium or a large, but I'll try and give you an indication as we go. If you do have the written pattern, I strongly suggest you follow that instead of this tutorial, as I have simplified those decreases down for the purposes of this tutorial, so it's a little easier for those that need a video tutorial to follow. So again, if you have the written pattern, go and have a look at how I do the decreases on that rather than this tutorial. So I have a total of 66 stitches here. So to make a decrease, I need to do a decrease stitch and then 4 half double crochets. However, if you're doing a medium, you need to do 5 half double crochets between your decreases, and a large, you need to do 6. I will explain this as I go. If you feel a little bit lost, don't worry, I got you. So I'm going to start my round with the number of half double crochet I need for the different sizes. So if you're doing a small, work 4 half double crochet here. If you're doing a medium, work 5. If you're doing a large, work 6. So I'm making a small, so I'm only doing 4. So it's really important if you're doing another size to make the right number of half double crochet here. So I've done 4, but you may have done 5 or 6. And now we're going to do a half double crochet decrease stitch. So if you've not done a decrease before, essentially what that decrease does is it takes multiple stitches on the previous row, and on the next row we turn those multiple stitches into one stitch. The easiest way to do a decrease is to skip a stitch. However, this can leave a hole. So instead we do something called a half double crochet 2 together. That sounds difficult, but it's easier than it is. So we're going to yarn over, put our hook into the next stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop, and then we're not going to finish off that half double crochet by pulling through those 3 loops. We're going to yarn over again and then put our hook into the next stitch. Then we're going to yarn over and pull up a loop. So you should have 5 loops on your hook, and then you're going to yarn over and pull through all 5 loops on your hook. And if you can see, we've got 2 stitches here, but we've only got 1 stitch on this round, so that is a decrease stitch. So let's see that again. So because I'm doing a small, I'm going to do 4 half double crochet but if you're doing a medium, you would do 5, and if you're doing a large, you would do 6. Again, the written pattern, it's a little bit clearer in the written pattern. It's hard to do a tutorial for 3 different sizes at once. So I've got my decrease stitch here, and then I've worked my 4 half double crochets, and then I'm going to do another decrease. So yarn over, put your hook into this stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, put your hook into the stitch, yarn over and pull up a loop, and that gives you 5 loops on your hook. So yarn over and pull through all 5. So let's give you a bit of a closer look at that decrease there. So if you can see, this stitch is 1 and it's going into 2 different stitches on the round below. So you're going to repeat this around, working 4, 5 or 6 half double crochets depending on your size, and then doing a decrease. And we're going to repeat that all the way around until you've finished this round. And you should have decreased by 11 stitches. So at the I started with 66 stitches. So at the end of this round I should have 11 less. So I should have 55. If you're a medium, you should have started with 77 stitches on your last round, and you should now be down to 66. And if you're doing a large, you should have had 88, and you should now be down to 77. As you can see, everything is divisible by 11, and I did this on purpose for the maths for this top of this hat. So finish this round and then I will show you what we're doing next. So I have finished that round of decreases. I've double checked and I definitely have 55 stitches now. If you're a medium, you should have 66, and if you're a large, you should have 77 stitches. So the other way to count is you can go around and count that you've definitely got 11 of these decrease stitches around that round of your hat. So we're only going to be doing decreases on every other round, so only on the right side rounds. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to slip stitch into the top of that half double crochet, and then I'm going to chain one, and then I'm going to turn over again and work from the back of the hat or the inside of the hat. And I'm going to work 1 half double crochet into each stitch with no decreases whatsoever. So do that and then come back and I will show you what we're doing for the rest of the crown of the hat. So I've finished my round of half double crochet from the wrong side, and I've done a slip stitch. So I'm going to chain one, that doesn't count as a stitch. Then I'm going to turn my hat over and we're going to do another round where we decrease by 11 stitches. So because my rounds are currently 55 stitches, that means I need to work 3 half double crochets and then a decrease, 3 half double crochets and a decrease. If you're a medium, you'll have 4 stitches between those decreases, and if you're a large, you'll have 5 stitches between those decreases. Whenever we do these decrease rows, the number of stitches between those decreases goes down by 1 each time as we get closer and closer to the top of our hat, until our very last round will be a round of 11 decreases with no stitches in between. So you're going to need to do another decrease round and then a round with no decreases, and continue like that, alternating between decreases and no decreases until you get to the top of that hat, like I said, where we just do 11 decreases. And then come on back to this tutorial, I'll show you a really neat way of sewing up that hole at the top of your hat. So I've just finished the final round of my hat, which was 11 decreases, and then I'm just going to do a slip stitch into the first stitch to join, just like we've done with all of the other rounds even. And then this time I'm not going to chain one, because I'm going to show you a really neat way of closing up this hole at the top of the hat. So I'm going to cut my yarn end and then thread. So I'm going to use my crochet hook to pull that yarn tail through that slip stitch, give it a pull, and then I'm going to thread that yarn tail onto a tapestry needle. And then to close up this hole on the top, what we're going to do is we're going to stitch through the front loops only. So I'll show you what that looks like. So here is my first stitch. I'm going through the front loop, and then I'm going to move over to the next stitch and going through that front loop only, and I'm going to work my way around my hat, going through all 11 stitches and only through that front loop. You'll be familiar with this technique if you've done amigurumi before, because this is the same way that you can use to close up the bottom of an amigurumi. Right, so this is my last stitch here. So I've gone through all those front loops, and then I'm going to pull on this yarn tail, and that will zip up the top of our hat nicely. So I do recommend after you have done this that you tie a bit of a knot, and I'm actually going to put my yarn through to the inside so I can tie my knot on the inside of the hat so that it won't be visible. Let me give that another pull here, and then I will just tie just a really simple knot by putting my yarn through a thread and then putting that needle through that loop that I've made. So now you just need to finish weaving off those ends. So here is our finished hat with that closed up at the top. You may want to add a pom-pom like I did to my pink hat here. I just think it's a little bit cute. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Please give me a thumbs up if you have, and consider buying the written pattern for this hat so that I can continue bringing you free crochet content. I will see you next time.